Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Before I get started, you might hear a cat meow during this. It's one of those uncontrollable things when working remotely, and my 17-year-old cat sometimes is very eager. So if you hear meowing, everything is okay. Uh, Today, we're going to be talking about some improvements in the Chef Infra Policy files, which if and it doesn't matter if you've used policy files in the past or if you're brand new to policy files. I think what I talk about today will make sense for that. We're going to go through just a little backstory on policy files, and then I'll show a demo. So let me push through here. Chef Infra Policyfiles, what are they and why should you use them? The improvements, particularly if you've been using Chef for a while, I think you'll appreciate how integrated they make everything, and by integrated I mean simplify what you're doing. Sort of pull everything together from within cookbooks and across cookbooks, and it's really powerful. And of course, if you have questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A widget that's part of this Zoom call. We'll do our best to answer those questions as we go. So, introduction to Chef Infra Policy files, why use them. When you're putting together a cookbook, you have a lot of different pieces. And the typical practice would be, okay, I've created a cookbook. I've created some attributes for that cookbook, and I push it up to the server. Maybe I also have a profile that I'm using with inspect compliance to basically verify the logic of my cookbook and to ensure that the state is being applied the way I wanted it to. Policy files and the new improvements with profiles bring this all together into one spot. And it's really going for the recommended way to do this work, because it is unified, it's simpler, and it has some other benefits that we'll talk about in a second. One of the key values of using policy files is it creates immutable artifacts. So think about it as a snapshot in time of a cookbook, all its content, your profile, anything that you have done. And when they're running in production, and particularly you want to know that these are exactly the objects and artifacts that you intend them to be, and the same as what you've tested in development. And policy files use a hash construct for revision versions that you can use and refer to. So that makes it even more secure, and sort of removes some of the risk and the doubt that you might have when you're deploying something into production, particularly. You have a single workflow that streamlines the rules and environmental patterns, that brings together the dependencies into a single flow. So rather than moving between separate cookbooks or separate profiles or whatever it happens to be, you can do it all in one place and do it effectively and quickly. And overall, from versioning, which is a critical part, if you're just hacking around on your own, you might not pay much attention to versioning. But once you get into an enterprise environment, it really matters what version of your cookbook and your other contents are being run at any particular time. And if there's a problem, being able to roll back to other versions, that sort of thing. So this just summarizes basically what I just said. Safer workflows, immutability, and the cookbook versions in those run lists are locked in, and it is faster from several aspects, not just only in your work as a developer, but in the execution as well. And it also brings you into roles and environments, and roles. You'll hear less talk about roles these days and more about environments. You have a test, a build, a production environment, and policy files allow you to attach that content to your particular environment. So, and you can move them and associate them as you go, which is pretty handy, very cool. When to use policy files. If you started using Chef and you create cookbooks and you upload cookbooks to your Infra server, that still works perfectly fine. If you're creating separate inspect profiles and you're separately uploading those to your Infra server with inspect compliance upload and things like that, also still works. But as I say, the immutability really gives you a way to lock in everything that you have in sort of one place, one document, basically your policy file, which can dramatically simplify the whole process that you're working on. It's particularly good for air-gapped environments because you can refer to local cookbooks and profiles, not ones that are necessarily on some remote Infra server or in a repo, GitHub repo or something like that. So there are a lot of different scenarios where policy files come in, but I would argue that policy files, once you get the hang of it and understand it, and particularly all the improvements in compliance, there are a lot of advantages to just use it as your primary go-to way of working with Chef. So the policy file and enhancements, there are a couple of things with the path, and there's a new cookbook name and metadata path helper. You can override run lists with policy files. So if you have assigned different run lists, policy files have a different hierarchy and can override them. You can run Test Kitchen with policy files, essentially using the same flow that you would on live nodes, using Test Kitchen and using Dockin or any of the other hypervisors locally, or even AWS and Azure. So you can use that. And the policy file views, and we'll take a look at in a little bit, are also available to you. Let's get into the demo. This is the fun part anyway, right? That's why everybody shows up to a webinar, let's be honest. The cookbooks, profiles, and policy files, oh my. In my environment that I'm going to be showing to you today, I have a Chef Automate and Infra server, which we have some documentation. I've created some videos that are available on the Chef blog. Spin up, quickly spin up an Infra server if you don't have one. You can also do this in the marketplace in AWS and Azure. Get started. I'm running Chef Workstation 21.9.613. By the way, Chef Workstation is the replacement for Chef TK. If you're still using Chef TK, please go to upgrade to Chef Workstation. Everything I show you today won't work with Chef TK. It's only with Chef Workstation, which has been around for well over a year and a half now. On the nodes, I've bootstrapped them with the latest Chef Infra client, and this is the bleeding edge release of 17.5.22. The tools, I'll be creating some cookbooks and showing you the recipes, policy files, and attributes, and the inspect profile, which is now part of this. The base configuration is, these are common tools. I don't have anything special here configured. So in the environment itself, I just went over that. I'll skip through that. This is what Chef Workstation looks like when you install it. This image on the right is the actual download page. There's a couple ways to do that. And the Chef-V shows you that you have it running on your workstation. One of the things that you can do, when you're bootstrapping nodes, whether it's one or two or hundreds, you've always been able to add recipes to the bootstrap. So when you're actually bootstrapping a node, it'll apply a recipe to its run list as on that first boot. So as soon as that thing boots up, it's doing that. You can do the same thing with policy groups and policy names. So when I create a policy, I can automatically assign it, which is something you don't have to do. It saves a step later on. So those are the tools. This is sort of the architecture. So I'm working on my workstation, developing my code. I'm pushing it to my Chef Infra server. And then when a Chef client runs on a node, it will pull from my Chef Infra server cookbooks, profiles, everything I need based on the policy group and apply that. This screen talks a little bit about what I'm about to show. Chef Generate Cookbook is one of the most common generators. Here, my cookbook is called Run Chef Client, which is going to create a very small policy cookbook, to create a cron job on Linux and a Windows task on Windows to run the client every 30 minutes. And I've added this K-K docken, which will, when I'm creating the cookbook, will automatically create a test kitchen.yaml file. So everything I do, I can test locally using test kitchen. One of the things that you'll see is this new include profile chef resource. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few seconds. Other things remain similar. If you've been using profiles in the past and compliance, you still have an inspect.yaml file, and you still have your compliance profiles and controls that are stored. The difference, though, is now they're all part of the cookbook and they're not separate. I'll also show in creating the attributes file is dramatically simplified when you use policy files, because everything is embedded, which is great. And there's no need in this workflow to use things like Knife Cookbook upload, of your particular project. You'll be using some other commands to do that. So I'm going to switch over to my other screen. Bear with me a second. Okay. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is my Chef Automate server, and I'm looking at the dashboard. I'm currently under the compliance. Under the infrastructure, I have 3 nodes on here. One's an RPi, Raspberry Pi 4, an Ubuntu 02 VM, and a Windows machine. Happens to be running Windows 10 Pro. You can see that these are attached to my prod policy group, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So let's take a look at the actual content and going through this process. What I've done, I ran my Chef Generate Cookbook and I called it Run Chef Client. I created this directory in my cookbooks folder, and it created a couple other things, including the test. It created the policy file RB, it created my recipes folder. It did not create the attributes folder automatically, but I added that. So the first thing I do in here, and of course, I update my metadata file, which makes life easier later on. This is just basically the information about the cookbook, and go right into my recipe. And in this case, you can see this new chef resource, include profile, and I'll talk about that in a second. But let me get to the guts of the actual cookbook. Here, I'm doing some logic to test if it's Windows or if not. And what I'm doing is, if it's a Windows platform, I'm using the chef resource to create a Windows task using a particular user and my super secret password. And if it's Linux or Mac, it'll use cron to do this work. Pretty straightforward. You can imagine yourself creating any kind of simple cookbook this way. Let me get rid of that. The attributes file, and I have in here, and I left in this green area, which I commented out in my VS Code IDE. When you're using compliance sort of without policy files, you need to add a whole bunch of information that interconnects your cookbook with your profile. With a policy file approach, you don't need that. You get to get rid of most of your audit attribute information. And I just have this single one left in here, which will do reporting via the CLI and to Chef Automate. So that's a major simplification as well. In here now is also a compliance folder. And in that are ultimately, there'll be within your compliance directory, within your cookbook, it has subfolders that are for profiles, waivers, and inputs. So again, you'll be able to include these things directly. This path in my profile in this example is called default. I could call it anything else, but it's the only one I have for this. And within that control is a controls folder, and then my actual profile. And it has a single control to run the chef client. And it's if it's Windows, hey, check, does this task exist? And hey, if it's on Linux, does this do? Does it create the cron job? And does the cron have the data I want? That sort of thing. But just to go back to this path, compliance profiles default, back in my my recipe, this include profile is pointing to that. This is the chef nomenclature to say, hey, look in the run chef client cookbook and look in the compliance profiles folder for a profile named default and include that. That's a key integration for what we're about to show. The simplification makes a big difference. Sorry, I just lost my screen. When you're putting everything together, in that control, the compliance profiles default controls is also an inspect.yaml file. This looks like a typical inspect file, no changes here. But in the old way, you used to have to link your attributes to separate attribute file had to have information from here in it just to make that connection to work. But the inspect.yaml file is created when you do a init profile, an inspect profile init with the name of the profile that you're using, and it will pre-populate most of this information. So the controls are here. Finally, the policy file itself. In this case, there's a lot of commented stuff here. I mostly gotten rid of that. But here's the name of my policy file. I have the default source in this is pointing to a remote, my infra server. The thing is, normally, yes, if I want to separately upload my profile to infra server, this is what I would use. But what I'm going to do instead in here is do a chef repo and put in the path of my actual cookbook, which is chef repo cookbooks, like that. And by doing that, when I run the Chef install in the next step, it'll grab all this information from this cookbook. The run list itself is, I have a single recipe, that default recipe that showed the logic. And if I had a specific sort of, I only had one cookbook, I could identify a local path like this. But this file could also, I could have multiple run lists, meaning multiple recipes from this cookbook or recipes across other cookbooks. And that's it. Everything is now in my cookbook directory. And I'm going to clear out of here. So this is another view of the same thing we were looking at in VS Code. I do a chef install policy file, RB. And what it just did was basically wrap everything together and stored it in memory. It went and took my cookbook, it took my profile, it took my attributes, took everything having to do with this particular cookbook, and pulled it together. Now I can do a chef push into the environment that I want. And I have an environment called prod. And then I'm going to use the policy lock.json file to push it. And said, hey, it worked. Everything is in there. So now I'm going to skip over to automate itself. So here we're under the infrastructure tab, my various nodes. I can drill down into my local automate server, go into the organization. That cookbook is here. I separately uploaded it. But first, let me look at the environments. Here's my prod environment. And by the way, you know, if I haven't created prod in here already, I can still do that chef push prod policy file .lock.json, and it won't automatically create it here, but it actually creates it on the server, so you can do it after the fact. My clients, again, are my various nodes, but most importantly, here's the policy file that I just uploaded with the push. It's sitting right here, run chef client. You notice I have a couple of others profiles in here. These profiles, unlike this one that I just demonstrated, it has a single run list. It has just this chef run in it. If I go back and look at you can take a look at this Linux one I have, which is sort of a replacement for a wrapper cookbook. Rather than having a single cookbook that refers to a whole bunch of others with all these objects that are all over the place, this particular profile includes 3 different cookbooks and the recipes from those cookbooks. The nice thing about that in a development world is whenever I make a change to any of these 3 cookbooks, I don't have to re-upload them, keep them in sync, and re-upload separate profiles. I can just do the same. I can run chef update instead of chef install policy.rb. It'll grab the latest and greatest from all of my resources on my local machine and push them up here. That makes a big difference, particularly, you know, in the immutability, and you're not chasing different elements of different cookbooks and being like, gee, I updated that cookbook, but oh, I forgot to upload that other recipe or whatever it happened to be. With policy files, it knows where your chef repo and cookbooks are. It knows what's essentially dependent for that profile and policy file. Bundles them all together and brings them up into the infra server. So this is a very good way. And you can see here again that the source was my local chef repo for these. So it grabbed everything from my local machine and pushed it up here. So the policy file itself, the policy groups, you know, I have prod. This is just another way of looking at it. This production environment has these 3 policy files in it. So the next phase, you know, if I'm applying this to a particular node, I would bootstrap it. And I've already bootstrapped a couple of devices in here, but I can run the chef client And I'm just going to do, actually, I'll just SSH into this particular node so you can see. But I could also do this using knife SSH or knife WinRM to execute something on a remote server in an ad hoc way. You notice it has this little tux with the IP address. That's part of that Linux policy file that I created. Cause, which is the application, is included as a handy thing, and it's part of my base Linux installation. But if I run sudo chef client now on this machine, it's going to go out, it's grabbing the information from my infra server. It knows that the profile has been assigned to it. And you can do that with knife node set policy and the policy name, and it automatically does that. And in this case, since I have the Linux profile applied, which includes my run chef client, it's up to date and everything is green and good to go. I can show you on knife node show my Raspberry Pi 4. Here I'm just looking at, what's been set on something. And right now it's using the run list from Linux. I could change that and do a knife node policy set. Sorry, the command just slipped out of my brain. But I would do this. I would set, this should work. There we go. So now if I do knife, notice it still thinks that that's the case. I'm going to go over back into notice now there's only one profile, and from my one policy file is done, rather than doing all three under the Linux. Now if I do knife node show, it should have updated this to say, yep, it's only running that one. So you can begin to see the value of having all of this stuff in one place, because it really simplifies everything that you have to do. I didn't have to run any knife commands to upload my cookbooks. I didn't have to run any inspect commands, and everything becomes an immutable object within there, within my profile. So let me see, stop the sharing. That's basically the extent of the demo. I see that there are some questions. There's a question: how did policy files help overcome roles and environments? Can you elaborate? Good question. Roles used to be a big part of, if you Google, there's some old content out there that talks about roles and environments. Roles are slowly being really replaced by this flow that I just described. And environments, as you saw, it's very easy to assign policy files to environments. So I can say, you know what, I have my run chef client cookbook and its profile to do my control tests. And first I'm going to roll it out to test. So I'm going to have a bunch of nodes that are in my test environment. I've assigned them to that environment by setting that during a bootstrap. Now I can assign my policy file to that environment, and any environment that has any node that is in that environment will get that policy automatically. Then when I feel good about my test, I can go through and say, okay, I'm going to add that policy file to my production nodes. And as soon as I do that, I can go through and apply it in anything that's in the production that has the production environment assigned is good to go. Another question here: are there plans to enable the view of cookbook within a policy from within the Automate UI? Great question, because if you notice, this process doesn't really yet show in Automate, and like I said, this is very bleeding edge. Some of the generators and other things like that coming out of Workstation aren't quite ready to match up with the Chef Infra client. In Automate, the same is true. You can't yet see the cookbook detail. I'm going to share my screen again because this is a good question that Larry has asked. Okay. In my Chef Infra server under lab, under cookbooks, you can see that there's a run Chef client cookbook. And this was not uploaded during this process that I just did with policy files, but the aim is to have them show up here. The value is you get to see all the contents of your cookbook, but you also notice that there's not yet the hook for my compliance folder. I can see my attributes and I can see my recipes. This is the recipe that I created. And any other files, but there's no compliance listed in here because it hasn't quite caught up, but that is on the roadmap. Question from Polly: how do the environments and policy groups play together? At one point, we were told policy groups replaced environments. Is it best practice to use one versus the other? With policy groups, you're really like you might have noticed when I pushed, I used chef push prod and then the policy lock file. You do need to, from a workflow standpoint, assign a policy to an environment, but you don't have to pre-create that environment. You can say, you know, I'm just doing a demo. I'm just going to create, I'm going to do a chef push demo name of my the policy file lock file. And it then brings that policy file through that environment. And then you can, but you don't have, your policy file isn't locked to a single environment. You can push it to other environments that way. So from a workflow standpoint, if you think about, okay, I have all my nodes, and I have some that are test and some are build or prod or demo, whatever it happens to be. When they're assigned that, they're assigned the policy group and the policy name. And the policy group is essentially giving that environment variable. So it's following it along. Nice thing is, as you're doing versioning, it's easy to look at, okay, I'm looking at my test and I'm using version 0.0, I mean 0.1.0. And I really want, okay, I've updated to 0.1.1. I can see in prod it's still 0.1.0, and I can track those differences over time. Hopefully that answered your question. What does the compliance subfolder have in a cookbook, and what is the importance of it? The compliance folder, which is in the root of your cookbook, will have a profiles directory, a waivers directory, and an inputs directory as part of it. In the profiles folder will be the names of your profiles, and within those named profiles will be a controls subdirectory and an inspect.yaml file. Waivers is if you're doing waivers, and waivers is a whole different conversation, but that's to say, you know, ignore this particular control when you're running when these circumstances exist. So that's what they're. The importance of it really is it's combined within your cookbook. And when you use the policy file, it's uploading all of those artifacts to your Infra server, where they're accessible not only by Infra server and Automate, but more importantly by your nodes. In which version was include profile added? That's the very latest version, 17.5.22 of the Chef client. If you attempt to run the include profile with an older client running on your nodes, it will fail because it will say, I don't recognize that resource. How are policy files versioned? In the, I need to move a screen there, thanks. In the policy file and within your metadata, you're setting values of the version as you go. So as you're making changes, you're going to be making incremental updates to the version as you go along. Versioning is really up to you, right? You know, it starts at 0.1.0. These are arbitrary. You may have some other convention that way that would start it higher than 1. But that's where you would do it. You notice in this too, I have Chef version greater than 16.0. Probably if I'm running this, I would probably make this greater than 17.5 to make sure that I don't get failures on the missing resource. Question here, you showed how much easier it was to upload the cookbook. What about the supermarket upload? Any changes with the upload process? If you're grabbing a cookbook that's publicly accessible from the supermarket, you could download it. And regardless of whether you created it or not, you can add it to not only its default recipe, but any of its recipes to your run list in the policy file of that, either that cookbook or another cookbook that brings in that supermarket cookbook. So when you do the chef install to create the policy file .lock.json and then do the chef push, it will go and grab that. Now, if the resource itself is in the supermarket, you can in your source, in here I have my local default source. I could set that to Chef Supermarket and point to the supermarket where it would grab that as well. If I wanted to skip over the part of downloading it, you know, I typically, if I use a supermarket cookbook, I'm making some change to it. I'm not using it raw, but sometimes use a raw publicly available supermarket cookbook. Set the default source here, it'll grab it. Let's see. How do you assign a policy to an environment? Using Chef Push, you provided a policy group and not an environment. And what is the difference between a policy group and an environment in the Automate server? Very good question. The environments within this context become essentially the same thing. If I created a policy group as I'm doing a Chef push, it won't automatically create an environment. I won't necessarily see something that's in here, but it will under my policy groups show here. Again, policy groups and policy names are really supplanting some of the environment and roles sort of nomenclature that we have used in the past. So there are ways to sort of bridge that with the policy files. You'll see that in here, this is the view of my little Ubuntu VM. You know, I don't have an environment in this raw snippet of the show. Really the policy group and the policy name become primary over sort of the environment that way. So it's a little shift in the paradigm. Let's see, I noticed that the environment in the Automate UI is not populated with the infrastructure tab. However, the policy group name shows an environment column and the node is a list in the organization view. Is this going to remain in this fashion? No, and as I said, the Infra client and this capability hasn't quite caught up to Automate, but the goal is that you will see these artifacts and be able to interact with them through these screens. Let's see, Gail said, I was asking if you are uploading your Chef Run client to your local supermarket. No, when I do a a Chef push, it's not pushing it to the supermarket, it's pushing it to my Chef Infra server. In my case, I have an on-prem Infra server. It's storing all my cookbooks, profiles, system information. Pushing something to supermarket is a different ball of wax altogether. There, you're posting something to be a publicly available cookbook or artifact, essentially. Question, can we define attributes in policy files? What is the priority if we define attributes in policy files? There is a hierarchy. I don't have it at the off the top of my head. Policy files will override sort of general assignments, but there is a hierarchy. If you look at the docs.chef.io, there's a little chart that shows you the hierarchy, like which takes precedence, essentially. You know, if I put a run list someplace else, and which is possible, which order of precedence ensures that what I think is being the run list and what is the run list can vary. But that's why I did this little demonstration of resetting the policy group and name for this particular node. And I could see that when I changed it in the, when I assigned it to a different policy, that it showed up for that node. Any other questions? Let me just switch back to another screen. Here's some resources. Learn Chef. The Chef Infra 101, we're doing some updates to a number of our Learn Chef, and it's an ongoing process, but there are some great resources there. I'm also working on an update of what I just talked about for a blog post that we have as part of Chef Infra 101, which includes a lot of aspects of Chef Inspect in the compliance phase. And that's not an accident, right? Because all these things are converging, rather than having to think about separate tools and do separate steps to essentially put your content into your infra server and distribute it. We're really working hard at Chef to bring all these things together into a unified, simple process. If you go to the docs on profiles, on policy files, I mean, docs.chef.io, you'll see a lot of the information I just talked about. We also have some release notes on the latest Chef client, and you can do a search for that on our releases page. And it shows some of these specific new capabilities. This is where you would find that. Discourse, it talks about this, the item that's talked about, listed here as Chef Infra Client 17.5.22 release, and this just ahead of the supermarket release. That release, the release notes in this case are very handy because they show you some very specific examples and underscore exactly what I just talked about. Are there any more questions? Let's see. For those that aren't familiar, can you show examples of putting attributes in a policy file and making them different for different policy groups? I think it'd be difficult to show you in a brief amount of time, but you can use a number of, if you go to the docs.chef.io and look at the attributes, there's quite a bit of data that you can draw and act upon, and you can set your controls. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but you can put some logic in there based on node resources that the chef client is aware of, and apply those things only if a certain circumstance exists. For example, you can look at memory, how much memory is available on a node, and only do something if it's below a certain percentage. And you might have different nodes with different amounts of memory, excuse me. But something like that would be able to read the what we call the OHI data, the information about the node itself, make decisions on the fly without having to be hard coded into your profile and policy files and attributes. Any other questions? Okay. I think that just about wraps it up. I can turn it over to Raisa.
Thanks, John.
Oh, there's one last question that came in. Can we change attributes once the lock file is generated? Yes, instead of running chef install, you run chef update on that policy file.rb. So any changes, not just to attributes, any changes you made before running that update will be now locked into that lock.json file, which can then be pushed. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Rice.
Thanks, John. That was like 20 minutes of Q&A. So I'm pretty sure that this session was really, really very informative for all of you. Thanks a lot, everyone, for joining webinar today. I guess, John, there is one more question in the chat section if you want to just go through that before we end this.
Let's see in the chat.
Yeah.
I'm not sure which one. Oh, can we include multiple recipes in a default RB file? Yes. In addition to the include profile, which is new, we've always had in modern history include recipe. Include cookbook. So yes, you can point to other cookbooks. From the policy file standpoint, you can refer in the run list entry to other recipes, either in the same cookbook or other cookbooks.
All right. So I believe other questions which is asked in the chat section, we have already answered them because people did ask the same question in the Q&A later. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining and attending today's webinar. If you guys really loved what you saw today, we encourage you to share this presentation and webinar once we share the on-demand version with you. The on-demand version should be available soon in a couple of few days, and we will email it to you as soon as it's ready. You will be able to access it using the same audience link that you're using now. So with that, thank you all once again and have a great day. Thanks a lot, John. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.